Constitution in Article 6 says, "In all treaties major which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land." Now this becomes problematic for the new country. As we mentioned, they were already selling territory that belonged to tribes to pay off the Revolutionary War debt. George Washington in 1790 starts dealing with this problem. He thinks he's got to, as the executive, he has to enforce the August 11th Treaty of Hopewell. He openly says that white people settled on the boundary and were intruding on Cherokee lands. And he's saying that he has to enforce the treaty and have them removed. He says exactly, "I shall conceive myself bound to exert the powers entrusted to me by the Constitution." So, and then he suggests something. He says, so compensation and the amount of dollars that are going to be made to the Cherokee for the land that they're going to have to relinquish now, we should hold the occupiers of that land accountable to the United States. In other words, the people that are squatting on Cherokee land are going to have to pay for it, and the United States is going to collect it. By the time of Jefferson, though, President Jefferson starts wrestling with two policies. One is assimilation and the other is removal. He thinks that Indians should possibly be removed to ensure the survival of their culture. However, it was going to be voluntary, and it was going to be encouraged for them to move westward. So by 1824, when Calhoun creates the Bureau of Indian Affairs to start dealing, by the way, it never was approved by Congress. Long story short, two sons of South Carolina. Now this was the slave state, the state that it openly took Indians as slaves. Okay, and then because of the Yamasee War, changed its mind on that policy. Long story short, the slave state, these two sons of it, Calhoun and Jackson, will successfully pass on May 28, 1830, the Indian Removal Act. Now, this act, as probably is the most intentional, it's not favorable. So, in 1830, the first tribe to face removal was the Choctaw. Now, if you remember in 1823, the Oneida, who had been loyal to the United States in the Revolutionary War period, were forcibly removed from New York to Wisconsin. So that's kind of the harbinger for tribes. So even if you've been loyal to the United States, you're going to face removal. And so indeed the Choctaw, who had sent 795 warriors, if you remember, to Pensacola, are facing removal. By 1832, the 6,000 that are removed, only 4,000 will arrive. So the significant loss in that year for Choctaws is still remembered. In 1832, the Muskogee were also forced to sign this removal treaty. It wasn't all carried out until later, but they would lose over 3,500 tribal members. The Seminole, also in 1832, were forced to sign the removal treaties. Many of them fled into the swamps, like the Choctaws that fled into the swamps that would become the Mississippi Band. The Seminoles that fled into the swamps in Florida would become the Seminole tribe, the Seminole Nation that's now in Florida. But the Seminole would suffer the highest percentage of losses, at 40%, when they lost over 2,000 of their tribal members during removal. Chickasaw, the numbers there are, I'm having a difficult time nailing those down on removal, but they also were forced to sign the removal in 1832. Now that year is important because in 1832, one of the great Rebel Alliance tribes, the Sac and Fox, will reinvigorate what little is left of the Rebel Alliance. They, and some of the Potawatomi, we don't know how much of the Ottawa, it's difficult to tell, probably some Miami, said they're not leaving Illinois. They didn't agree with the removal treaty, and so it's known as the Black Hawk War. And engagements that the tribe won and lost, but eventually they lose on August the 2nd at Bad Axe, the Battle of Bad Axe. Now the reason the war is remembered is because it started because he and his 1,500 people of his confederacy there were attacked by the Illinois militia. Now one of the young militia officers at that time was President Abraham Lincoln. Now what is important about this is that there's an apocryphal story that says that Abraham Lincoln would not allow the militia to execute prisoners of war. And he stopped, at least on one event, he stopped them from doing so against the Potawatomi. Long story short, the Sac and Fox suffered multiple losses. They were moved at first out of Illinois into Iowa. They moved out of Iowa down into what's now what would be called the northern part of Kansas, which is still Indian Territory, southern part of the Nebraska area, and then eventually they will be removed all the way into Oklahoma. Now, the map that I use there is one from 1835, and this map says showing the lands assigned to the immigrant Indians west of Arkansas and Missouri. The map should say showing the lands assigned to the refugee Indians west of Arkansas and Missouri. And I'm not being political by that, because the tribes were not immigrating. They did not say, "Hey, oh, okay, so we got new land over here." In fact, they were being forcefully evicted from their own lands at the point of a gun. So the map is informative because it shows the significance of the removals. So in 1835, you start seeing they're calculating the numbers that they're going to remove. The Delaware, they're going to remove 826 of them. Shawnee, 1,250. 470 Kickapoo. 200 Ottawa. Piankeshaws, Potawatomis. You keep going on, and there's a reason that I put the pictures of the tribes from the Year of the Indian on here. It's because you can look at these numbers and disregard it as talking about humans. We're talking about humans that they're going to round up at the end of a gun and force into west of the Mississippi. Statement of the number of Indian tribes east of the Mississippi in 1835. And then it says statement of the number of Indian tribes residents west of the Mississippi. Now they're calculating the tribes in the west that they're going to be moving as well, which includes the Osage, the Washaji, the Poncas, the Caddos. They're already discussing plans of moving them into what will become Indian Territory. And by the way, that's why Haskell is where it's at in Lawrence, Kansas, because there was a military, there's a fort there. So as we start reading the provisions that are on the map, like for instance the notation that this tract was set aside for the Sac and Fox. However, they instead moved the Omaha, Iowas, and Otoe, Missouri onto it. It's those little details of that just create this. Now the map is signed February 23rd, 1836. So we know that the Bureau created the data in 1835. That's why I said in 1835. Now the reason that's important is because in 1835 the Cherokee will be forced to sign their final removal act, and as a result of that, if we start looking at where the tribes were, New York, you can see where the Delaware used to occupy near New York City. Remember, they were part of that area that traded with New Amsterdam, and then after it was conquered, after the Anglo-Dutch War, it turned into New York. The Seneca-Cayuga, which used to own the entire swath along Lake Ontario, have been diminished to smaller and smaller and smaller reservations that you can see there. Well, they will lose all that land. As we mentioned in 1823, the Oneida, who sided with the United States in the Revolutionary War, are removed from New York and sent to Wisconsin. So in the Treaty of 1789, the Seneca-Cayuga have to surrender their large holding in Pennsylvania. Remember, they are the keepers of the western door, so the west door has fallen. The Delaware and the Shawnees that had been around Fort Pitt and traded with them during that time have already been squeezed out of Pennsylvania by this time. Eventually they're squeezed into Ohio, and then after the Treaty of Greenville, after that rebel alliance is conquered by Mad Anthony Wayne, you see the Shawnees, the Delawares, the Miamis, the Wyandottes, and the Kickapoos that occupied Ohio are moved out. They moved west. Then they're moved into what's now called Indiana, or People of the Indians, the territory of the Indians. The Potawatomi, Wyandotte, Kickapoo, Miami, Delaware again are forced to remove and move west again. So we're talking about multiple. The removals are actually multiple and in segments. Eventually, a number of them will be removed and that are still occupying the state of Illinois, as we mentioned then in 1832 because of the Black Hawk War, are removed from there. The Potawatomi, Ottawa, and the Sac and Fox. The Ottawa, as we remember, owned Chicago. They owned the Chicago, according to treaty, they could stay there forever. The Potawatomi, Miami, and Kickapoo were pushed out of Michigan, and then the Ottawa and Potawatomi are also shoved out of the territory of Wisconsin, where the Oneida, ironically, had been moved to. So now the movement is pushing west and south, and so a number of the tribes that are occupying in Iowa, specifically the Iowa, and the Sac and Fox, and the Otoe, Missouri, now have incursions of Ottawa and Potawatomi. Well, they won't be there for much longer. They're going to be shoved out of what's now Iowa into what's the southern part of Nebraska, northern part of Kansas, and the southern part of the Indian Territories. The tribe that lost most significant land after this is the Washaji, the Osage. They own St. Louis, by the way, which is why I find their claim to Cahokia to be credible, the largest mound site. The Peoria claim it as well, that it was an Illinois tribe that built the Mississippian mounds. The Washaji were a very powerful tribe. The French dealt with them extensively. As I mentioned, they joined in the French and Indian War as well. But you see the Sac and Fox that have been shoved down, and the Otoe, Missouri, they're going to be shoved west into Kansas. Indeed, the Washaji give up a large segment of in Arkansas as well. Arkansas is named from the Quapaw, the Ogapa, which means South Wind people. The Caddo are shoved out of Arkansas as well. In the north, in Nebraska, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, the Ponca, the Pawnee, and the Otoe, Missouri are going to start being shoved south. And so Kansas, which at this time only has the Pawnee and the Kaw on the west and the Kiowa on the west, the Kaw on the east and the Kiowa on the west, are going to see an influx of all those tribes, according to the 1835 map. In the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, the Cherokee are guaranteed that they will be given a delegate in the House of Representatives. However, it must be known how much the land removal cost the five tribes. The Cherokee lost over 4,000, the Choctaw over 2,000, the Creeks 3,500, and the Seminoles lost the largest percentage, nearly 40% of their people. They lost 2,000. Based on that, because I have not found data on this, historically you can make a projection of the tribes that they're talking about that they're going to remove to Indian Territory eventually. You can just do a 20% loss, which is probably the low end, closer to what the Choctaw lost, or a 40% loss, which was the high end. And you can see that the significance of loss for those tribes, the smaller tribes, was staggering as well. Long story short, 502 million acres were lost by this time, by 1841. The Nez Perce were eventually removed to Indian Territory. In 1877, they were here for 7 years. They were from Oregon. They, at that time, traveled the farthest. But the tribe that came the farthest was from California. California between 1846 and 1870 suffered what's known as a genocide. The population went from 150,000 to 30,000 after the discovery of gold and the influx of all the settlers into that area. There's an interesting documentary called Ishi, The Last of Yahi. 1913, he came out of the woods and revealed that not all of his people were dead, he was still alive. But the tribe that suffered probably the highest, most significant losses in some ways was the Modoc. Captain Jack, with 57 braves, when they tried to remove him, he had fled from Northern California, where they owned the redwoods, by the way, into the Klamath, and the Army was trying to force them back onto the Klamath Reservation, started the Modoc War. He fought 1,000 men with 57 Modoc, and they had howitzers and mortars and all that kind of stuff, and his people still struggled, but they were eventually put on cattle cars and were transported 2,000 miles back here to first to Kansas and then finally to Oklahoma. So the